In 1869, when the golden spike was driven at Promontory Summit, the newspapers celebrated the iron. They wrote poems about the locomotives. They praised the engineers and the financiers and the politicians who made transcontinental travel possible. Nobody wrote about the trees. But here is what those newspapers failed to mention. For every single mile of track that stretched across this continent, roughly 3,000 trees had to die. Not symbolically, not as a metaphor for progress. 3,000 actual trees, cut down, stripped, shaped, and buried in gravel so that iron wheels could roll over their corpses. By 1890, America had laid over 163,000 miles of railroad track. Do the math with me. That is 489 million wooden ties. And since each tie lasted only 5 to 7 years before rotting in the ground, the railroads were not just building. They were constantly rebuilding, constantly replacing, constantly consuming. The forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Pacific Northwest did not disappear because Americans wanted lumber for their homes. Those forests vanished because the railroads were hungry, and they never stopped eating. This is the story of the men who fed that hunger, the tie hackers who lived in temporary camps and swung broad axes 12 hours a day, the timber cruisers who walked into virgin forest and decided which ancient trees would become railroad ties, the creosote workers who soaked wood in carcinogenic chemicals until their skin turned black and their lungs filled with tar. These men built America's transportation network, and America forgot their names before their bodies were cold. Let me take you into the forest. The year is 1882. The location is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about 40 miles from any town you have heard of. The temperature is 14 degrees below zero. The snow is 4 feet deep, and somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a camp of 200 men is waking up before dawn to cut trees for the railroad. The camp cook has been awake since 3 in the morning. His name is probably lost to history, but we know what he did. He fired up the massive iron stoves in the cookhouse and began preparing breakfast for 200 men who would burn 4,000 calories before sunset. Salt pork fried in its own fat. Beans that had been soaking overnight. Biscuits made from flour, lard, and baking powder, baked in pans the size of wagon wheels. Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. I'm served in tin cups that burned your lips if you drank too fast. The men ate in silence. This was not a social hour. This was fuel intake. They had maybe 20 minutes to consume enough calories to swing an axe until noon, when they would pause briefly for a cold lunch carried in their pockets, then continue swinging until the light failed. The camp itself looked like something between a military outpost and a refugee settlement. Long bunkhouses made of rough-cut logs, each one holding 40 men in wooden bunks stacked 3 high. The bunks were lined with straw that harbored lice and bed bugs no matter how often it was changed. The air inside smelled of sweat, wood smoke, wet wool, and the peculiar sour odor of men who had not bathed since November and would not bathe again until spring. There was a cookhouse that served 4,000 calories of food per man per day, because anything less and the workers cannot physically perform the labor required. A blacksmith shop for sharpening axes, where a German immigrant named Schneider or Schmidt worked the bellows and heated steel until it glowed orange. A stable for the draft horses, massive Belgian and Percheron breeds that could drag loaded sledges through snow that would bury a normal horse to its chest, and surrounding all of it, stumps. Thousands of stumps stretching in every direction, marking the graves of trees that stood for centuries before the railroads decided they were needed elsewhere. The men in these camps were not career lumberjacks. Most of them were farmers from the upper Midwest, who could not make enough money during winter months. On Scandinavian immigrants who arrived with nothing but strong backs and a willingness to work. Norwegian brothers named Olsen or Larsen who sent money home to families they might never see again. Swedish men who had fled compulsory military service and found that American timber camps demanded a different kind of sacrifice. There were French Canadians who followed the timber industry south when their own forests began to thin. They brought their own vocabulary with them. Words like peavey The hooked pole used to roll logs, cant hook, the similar tool without the spike, caulk boots, pronounced cork, the spiked footwear that kept men from slipping on icy logs, and scattered among them, Civil War veterans who found that swinging an axe was easier than remembering what they had done at Antietam or Gettysburg. Men who woke up screaming in the bunkhouses and pretended the next morning that nothing had happened. Men whose 1,000-yard stares went undiagnosed and untreated because the concept of combat trauma did not yet exist in any formal medical sense. They earned between $26 and $40 per month depending on skill and experience. The company deducted the cost of room and board, which meant most men walked away with maybe $15 of actual cash after working 30 days straight without a single day off. Some camps operated company stores where inflated prices absorbed whatever wages the company had not already reclaimed. But the money is not the story. The work is the story. A railroad tie in 1882 had to meet specific dimensions. 8 feet long, 8 inches wide on the face, 6 inches thick, cut from white oak, preferably, though companies would accept red oak, chestnut, or various softwoods when hardwoods became scarce. The tie had to be squared on 2 sides so it would sit flat on the roadbed, with the bark still attached to the other 2 sides. Creating that tie from a standing tree required a specific sequence of violence against wood that had been growing since before the American Revolution. First, the timber cruiser. Before any cutting began, a man had to walk into the forest and identify which trees were worth taking. The cruiser worked alone, usually, navigating by compass through stands of white pine and oak that had never been mapped. He carried a notebook, a hatchet for blazing trails, and enough food for several days in the wilderness. The cruiser's job was to estimate the value of a stand of timber. How many board feet of lumber could be extracted? How many ties could be cut? What obstacles would the logging crew face? Were there rivers nearby for floating the cut timber out? The cruiser's estimates determined which forests the company would buy or lease, and a good cruiser could save his employer thousands of dollars by identifying stands that looked promising, but would prove impossible to log efficiently. After the cruiser came the road crew. These men cut trails through the forest so that horse-drawn sledges could reach the cutting areas. They felled smaller trees, graded rough paths through the snow, and built ice roads by packing snow and then pouring water over it to create a slick surface that reduced friction for the loaded sledges. Then came the fallers. A faller worked with a partner, both men wielding double-bit axes, cutting a notch into the trunk on the side where they wanted the tree to fall. The notch had to be precisely angled. Too shallow and the tree might twist as it fell, crushing anyone standing in the wrong place. Too deep, and you wasted wood that could have been another tie. The notch cutting itself was a display of controlled violence. Each axe blow removed a chip of wood the size of a man's hand. The chips flew in arcs, landing in the snow, accumulating in piles that marked how long the men had been working on any particular tree. A large white oak might require 50 notch blows on each side before the fallers moved to the back cut. Once the notch was cut, the fallers moved to the opposite side of the trunk and began the back cut. This was cross-cut saw work, on 2 men pulling a 6-foot blade back and forth through green wood that sometimes froze solid overnight. The saw would bind in the cut. The men would drive wedges behind the blade to keep it moving. Their breath would freeze in their beards, forming icicles that clinked together with every pull of the saw. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the tree would start to lean. The sound a large white oak makes when it begins to fall is not a crack. It is a groan, a deep, almost animal sound that rises in pitch as the trunk separates from the stump. The wood fibers, compressed under tons of weight for decades, finally giving way, snapping individually at first, then in cascades, then all at once. The fallers had roughly 3 seconds to read the direction of the fall and move. 3 seconds to grab their tools and sprint through 4 feet of snow while a 60-foot tree accelerated toward the ground at 32 feet per second squared. The ground shook when a large tree landed. Snow exploded outward from the impact point. Branches snapped and flew like shrapnel. Smaller trees caught in the fall path went down too, creating chain reactions that could kill a man standing 50 feet from the original target. Men died here. The Bureau of Labor Statistics did not start tracking logging fatalities until 1912, but industry estimates suggest that 1 in 4 loggers suffered a serious injury during any given season. Crushed by falling trees, pinned under rolling logs, gashed by axes that glanced off frozen wood, drowned during spring log drives when the rivers broke free. One company physician in Wisconsin, a doctor, Morrison, who left detailed records, documented treating 11 skull fractures, 23 broken limbs, 15 amputations, and 4 deaths during a single 4-month cutting season in 1886. His camp employed 240 men. Nearly 1 in 4 went home damaged, if they went home at all. The amputations were performed on kitchen tables in the camp cookhouse, with whiskey for anesthesia and a saw, not much different from the ones used to fell trees. Dr. Morrison recorded one case of a man whose leg was crushed by a rolling log. The bone was shattered in 17 places. There was no possibility of repair. Morrison took the leg off above the knee while 4 men held the patient down, and the patient lived, though Morrison noted in his journal that the man's screams could be heard throughout the camp. But the tree is down. The faller has survived. Let us continue. After the faller came the bucker. His job was to cut the fallen trunk into 8-foot sections, each one destined to become a single railroad tie. The bucker worked alone, usually, moving down the length of the tree with a crosscut saw, measuring by eye because pulling out a tape measure would slow him down. A good bucker could section a tree in 20 minutes. A great bucker could do it in 12. The difference between good and great was worth money. Companies paid piece rates for bucking work, and the fastest men could earn significantly more than their wages suggested. The bucker had to read the wood as he worked. Every tree has internal stresses, tensions created by uneven growth or years of leaning against prevailing winds. Cut in the wrong place and the trunk will pinch the saw blade, by trapping it in a grip that requires wedges and leverage and precious time to escape. Cut in the right place and the saw glides through, the section separating cleanly, ready for the next man in the sequence. Then came the tie hacker. This was the aristocrat of the woods, the man whose skill determined how many usable ties a camp could produce in a day. The tie hacker took those 8-foot rounds and turned them into squared timbers, using nothing but a broadaxe and a knowledge of wood grain that took years to develop. The broadaxe is a terrifying tool. The blade is 12 inches wide, beveled only on one side, with a handle that curves away from the cutting edge to keep the user's knuckles from scraping against the log. A skilled tie hacker would score the round with a regular axe first, cutting notches every few inches along the length. These score marks created fracture points that would guide the final shaping cuts. Then the hacker would stand on top of the log, his caulk boots gripping the frozen bark, and swing the broadaxe downward. The blade would catch the scored wood and shear it away in long, clean strips. Ribbons of oak peeling back like skin from muscle, revealing the pale heartwood beneath. 2 sides per tie, 60 swings per side on a large timber. 120 full-power axe swings per tie, and a good hacker was expected to produce 25 to 40 ties per day. That is 3,000 to 5,000 axe swings, every single day. For the entire winter cutting season, which ran from November until the spring thaw made the ground too soft for sledge roads. The tie hacker's hands would blister, then callous, then crack open in the cold until they bled. They wrapped their palms in strips of cloth torn from old shirts, but the cloth would soak through with sweat and blood and freeze solid by mid-afternoon. Their shoulders and backs developed permanent asymmetry from the repetitive motion. The muscles on their dominant side grew thick and dense, while the other side remained normal, giving veteran hackers a lopsided appearance that marked them as clearly as a brand. Their hearing degraded from the constant impact of steel on wood. The thunk of the broadaxe, repeated 5,000 times a day, damaged the delicate structures of the inner ear. By age 40, most hackers could not follow normal conversation without cupping a hand behind their ear and asking you to repeat yourself. And when they were too old or too injured to swing a broadaxe, There was no pension waiting, no company loyalty, just a handshake and a final paycheck and a long walk to wherever they might find different work. Many ended up in poorhouses. Others drifted into alcoholism. A few found work as night watchmen or janitors, jobs where their damaged bodies could still earn enough to survive. But here is the part that truly reveals the scale of what we are discussing. Everything I have just described got you one railroad tie, one 8-foot timber out of one section of one tree. The railroads needed 3,000 of them per mile, for 163,000 miles of track by 1890, plus replacements for the ties that rotted out every 5 to 7 years. The Northern Pacific Railroad alone consumed 3 million ties per year just for maintenance on existing track. The Union Pacific used 2 million, the Southern Pacific another 2 million. The smaller regional lines collectively used tens of millions more. Combined, the American railroad industry was consuming between 30 and 40 million ties annually by the late 1880s. At 25 ties per day per hacker, producing 40 million ties required 1.6 million man-days of tie hacking labor, plus the felling, plus the bucking, plus the transportation from forest to rail yard, plus the treatment, plus the installation. The railroads did not just employ lumberjacks, they employed an army that worked in conditions the actual military would have considered inhumane, for wages that barely covered a man's expenses, on producing a product that would rot in the ground within a decade and need to be replaced with another product made by another army of men working in the same conditions. And we are still talking about the cutting, the relatively easy part. Getting those ties from the forest to the railroad was its own logistical nightmare. Most timber camps were built near rivers for a reason. Once the ties were cut and squared, they were skidded to riverbanks by teams of horses and oxen, then stacked on the ice to wait for spring breakup. The stacking itself was skilled work. Stack the ties wrong, and they would tumble into the water prematurely, potentially damaging the ice and drowning men who stood too close. When the ice melted and the rivers ran high with snowmelt, the ties went into the water by the thousands. The log drive was perhaps the most dangerous phase of the entire operation. Men called river pigs would ride the floating ties downstream, using pike poles and peaveys to keep the timber moving, to break up jams before they dammed the entire river, to rescue ties that got caught in eddies or lodged against rocks. Picture this. You're standing on floating timber in a river swollen with snowmelt. The water temperature is 34 degrees. The ties beneath your feet are spinning, rolling, bumping against each other in random patterns that shift with every wave and current change. You are wearing wool clothing that weighs 20 pounds when dry and 60 pounds when wet. You are carrying a 12-foot pike pole that you use to push and pull the timber, to vault from one tie to another, to catch yourself when you slip. And you will slip. Everyone slips. The survivors are the ones who slip and recover before the gap between ties closes on their legs. The water temperature during spring breakup hovered just above freezing. The men worked soaked to the chest, sometimes to the neck, for 12 hours at a stretch. Hypothermia was constant, not the dramatic kind where you fall down and die, the slow kind where your thinking gets fuzzy, where you start making mistakes you would never make when warm, where the gap between the ties suddenly looks wider than it did a moment ago, and you hesitate just long enough to get caught. Drowning was common. Getting caught between two floating ties and crushed was the fate that veterans feared most. A human body between two oak timbers, each one weighing 500 pounds or more, I propelled by the force of a flooding river. The mathematics of that collision do not favor the human. The Menominee River in 1881 carried over 6 million ties downstream in a single spring drive. 11 men died during that drive. Their bodies, when recovered, were shipped home in the same rail cars that carried the timber their deaths had helped harvest. The company sent letters of condolence to the families. The letters did not mention compensation, because there was none. But let us say the ties survived the river. Let us say they arrived at the mill town intact, ready for the next phase of processing. The problem with raw wooden ties is that they rot. White oak can last 7 to 10 years in the ground under ideal conditions, but most ties face conditions that were far from ideal. Water pooling around the base with every rainstorm, fungal spores in the soil attacking the wood fibers from below, insect larvae boring into the wood grain, creating channels for moisture and decay, expansion and contraction with every freeze-thaw cycle, cracking the fibers open to more damage. The railroads tried everything to extend tie life. They charred the ends over open flames to create a protective carbon layer. They soaked ties in zinc chloride solutions that smelled like industrial waste. They painted them with coal tar, a thick black substance that came from gas manufacturing plants. None of it worked well enough to satisfy the accountants. Then, in the 1870s, a German process using creosote began to spread through the American railroad industry. Creosote was a byproduct of coal tar distillation, a thick, an oily substance with the consistency of warm molasses and a smell that combined burnt rubber with decaying meat. The substance penetrated deep into wood fibers and poisoned anything that tried to consume them. Fungi could not grow in creosoted wood. Insects would not bore into it. A creosoted tie could last 25 years in the ground, maybe longer. The railroads built treatment plants across the country. Enormous facilities where raw ties were stacked in sealed cylinders the size of railroad cars, subjected to vacuum pressure to remove air and moisture from the wood, then flooded with creosote, heated to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure forced the creosote deep into the wood grain, saturating every fiber, turning pale oak timber into something that looked and smelled like it had been excavated from a tar pit. The men who worked in these plants absorbed creosote through their skin, their lungs, their eyes. The compound is now classified as a probable carcinogen, linked to scrotal cancer in studies dating back to the 1930s, linked to lung cancer and bladder cancer in more recent research. In the 1880s, no one knew or cared about those links. What they knew was that creosote workers developed distinctive skin conditions. Their arms turned black and stayed black no matter how hard they scrubbed. Their eyes burned constantly, watering with every shift. They coughed up dark phlegm that smelled like a burning city. The average creosote worker lasted 3 to 5 years before the job rendered them unable to continue. Many of them moved on to other railroad work if they could find it. And others simply disappeared into the vast American underclass of broken men who built the infrastructure that respectable citizens took for granted. We have discussed the cutting, we have discussed the transport, we have discussed the treatment. Now let us talk about what all of this actually looked like where the rails met the earth. Imagine standing at a railroad construction site in Nebraska in 1885. The year the Northern Pacific completed its transcontinental line to the coast. In front of you stretches the graded roadbed, a raised platform of compacted earth and gravel extending to the horizon in both directions. The grade crew finished their work weeks ago, and their camps have already moved 20 miles ahead, cutting through hills, filling in valleys, preparing the ground for what comes next. Behind you, the track is complete. So twin lines of iron rail stretching back toward Chicago, toward the East Coast, toward everything you left behind. Every quarter mile, you can see the gleam of fish plates connecting rail sections. Every few hundred yards, a telegraph pole carries wires that keep the construction crews in contact with headquarters. But here, at the railhead, everything is chaos. Flat cars arrive every hour carrying ties. Not dozens, thousands. Each flat car holds roughly 400 ties stacked in interlocking layers, and the construction trains sometimes stretch 40 cars long. That is 16,000 ties in a single delivery, enough to lay 5 miles of track if everything goes perfectly. Nothing ever goes perfectly. The tie unloading crew works with choreographed precision. Teams of men roll ties off the flat cars and onto waiting wagons. Draft horses pull those wagons to the distribution point, where other men unload the ties and space them along the graded roadbed. The ties go down first, 20 inches apart, center to center, along the entire length of the grade. That is 3,020 ties per mile laid out in parallel rows, each one positioned so the rails will sit precisely 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart when installed. Then come the gaugers. These men walk the line with measuring sticks, checking the spacing on every single tie, adjusting positions by fractions of an inch. A tie that sits too close to its neighbor creates a weak point where the rail can flex and eventually break. A tie that sits too far creates another weak point with the same result. The gauger's work is tedious, backbreaking, and absolutely critical. A single misplaced tie can cause a derailment that kills dozens. Then the rail comes forward. An iron rail in 1885 weighs between 60 and 80 pounds per yard. A standard 30-foot rail weighs around 600 pounds. Teams of 8 men carry each rail from the supply cars to the railhead using special tongs that distribute the weight across multiple handlers. They carry these rails at a jog, not a walk, a jog, because the construction trains are waiting behind them, and every minute of delay costs money. And the railroad companies have schedules to keep and investors to satisfy and competing lines to outpace. The rail gangs worked in shifts, rotating constantly to prevent exhaustion from slowing the pace. Fresh teams would materialize from the supply trains every hour, grabbing the tongs from men whose arms were shaking, continuing the forward motion without ever fully stopping. Behind the rail carriers came the spikers. 2 spikes per tie, 4 ties per rail section, 8 spikes driven with heavy hammers to hold each length of iron in place. The sound of simultaneous hammer blows echoed across the prairie like industrial thunder, a rhythm that continued 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for years. The spikers used 10-pound hammers with handles worn smooth by thousands of grips. Each spike required 3 to 5 blows to drive home. A good spiker could drive 6 spikes per minute. A great spiker could drive 8. The difference was the difference between regular wages and bonus pay, between respect and anonymity, between being a spiker and being a man who just held a hammer. The Transcontinental Railroad averaged roughly 2 miles of track per day during peak construction. The Union Pacific once famously laid 10 miles in a single day as a publicity stunt, though workers collapsed from exhaustion and several had to be carried from the line. Let us consider what those numbers actually mean. 2 miles per day equals 6,000 ties installed. 6,000 ties means 12,000 spikes driven. 12,000 hammer blows at minimum. More likely, 24,000 when you account for misstrikes and bent spikes that need to be removed and replaced. The average spiker swung his hammer 3,000 times during a shift. His forearms developed abnormal muscle density. His wrists suffered repetitive stress injuries that would not have a medical name for another century. His hearing degraded from the constant metallic percussion until, by age 40, most spikers could not follow normal conversation. The Chinese workers who built much of the Central Pacific Line through the Sierra Nevada suffered additional hardships. Hanging from ropes to drill blasting holes in sheer cliff faces. Working through tunnels where the air was thick with rock dust and nitroglycerin fumes. Living in camps that white workers refused to share, eating food that white workers refused to serve them, accepting wages that were 30% lower than white workers received for identical labor. When the Golden Spike ceremony took place at Promontory Summit, the Chinese workers were not permitted to appear in the official photographs. The forest did not disappear overnight. And the devastation happened gradually enough that people who lived through it could convince themselves it was not really happening. In 1850, the state of Michigan contained roughly 38 million acres of forest. White pine, red pine, hemlock, oak, beech, maple, trees that had been growing since before European contact, some of them 400 years old, their trunks so large that 3 men linking hands could not encircle them. By 1900, Michigan's original forest was functionally gone. 90% of it had been logged. The remaining 10% existed in scattered fragments, isolated stands too inaccessible or too worthless to attract the timber company's attention. Wisconsin followed the same trajectory. Minnesota followed after that. When the Great Lakes forests were exhausted, the industry moved to the Pacific Northwest. And the same cycle began again with Douglas fir and western red cedar. The railroads were not solely responsible for this deforestation, but they were the engine that drove it. The railroads created demand for timber products. The railroads provided transportation for getting those products to market. And the railroads consumed directly a substantial fraction of everything that was cut. By one estimate, the railroad industry used 15% of all lumber produced in America during the 1880s. Another estimate puts the number closer to 22%. The exact figure matters less than the underlying reality. The railroads were one of the largest industrial consumers of wood products in human history, and they maintained that position for nearly a century. Consider the replacement cycle. A tie lasts 7 years on average before it needs to be swapped out. By 1890, with 163,000 miles of track in service, the railroads needed to replace roughly 23,000 miles worth of ties every single year. That is 69 million ties annually just to maintain existing infrastructure, not counting new construction. The forests were not being harvested. They were being mined, extracted without any plan for renewal, without any consideration for what the landscape would look like once the trees were gone. What the landscape looked like was barren. Cutover land in Michigan and Wisconsin was a wasteland of stumps and slash, the debris of treetops and branches that the loggers left behind because only the main trunks were valuable. That slash dried out during summer months and became fuel for wildfires that swept across thousands of square miles. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871 killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people in northeastern Wisconsin. The Hinckley Fire of 1894 killed over 400 in Minnesota. The Great Fire of 1910 burned 3 million acres across Idaho and Montana. All of these fires were made worse by the logging slash that covered the ground, providing kindling for blazes that no firefighting effort could contain. The land that survived the fires became agricultural, eventually after decades of struggle. Farmers moved onto cutover land expecting to find rich soil beneath the stumps, because where else would such massive trees have grown? What they found instead was thin, sandy earth that could barely support potatoes and dairy cattle, nothing like the farmland they had left behind in Ohio or Pennsylvania. Those farmers' children and grandchildren are still living on that land today, still fighting soil that was never meant for row crops, still dealing with an ecological legacy that began when their great-great-grandfathers swung broadaxes at trees destined for railroad ties. We should talk about what this means, what it actually signifies about the nature of progress and the price we pay for it. The railroad transformed America. This is not disputable. Before the railroads, it took 6 months to travel from New York to San Francisco. After the railroads, it took 6 days. Before the railroads, agricultural goods rotted in the fields because there was no way to ship them to market. After the railroads, wheat from Kansas fed cities on the Atlantic coast. Before the railroads, the American West was an abstraction, a story people told about somewhere else. After the railroads, it was a destination you could reach for the price of a ticket. The railroads unified the country, connected the economy, enabled the Industrial Revolution to spread beyond the eastern seaboard, made possible the urbanization, the immigration, the explosive growth that turned a former British colony into a global power within a single lifetime. All of this is true. Also true, the railroads accomplished this transformation by consuming the natural world at a rate that had no historical precedent, by employing hundreds of thousands of workers in conditions that destroyed their bodies, by externalizing every cost that could be externalized onto people and places with no power to object. The tie hackers did not share in the wealth the railroads created. They earned subsistence wages, suffered injuries that went uncompensated, and died in accidents that were classified as routine. The forests they cut did not regenerate in their lifetimes. The rivers they drove were choked with sediment and sawdust for generations after the log drives ended. We built something remarkable. And the people who did the actual building were treated as disposable components in a machine that cared about outputs, not inputs. That measured success in miles of track laid, not limbs lost. That celebrated completion ceremonies while the men who made completion possible were already forgotten. There is a certain kind of American story that presents progress as costless. as something that happened through ingenuity and entrepreneurship and the natural superiority of free markets. This story is comfortable. But it fits on inspirational posters. It does not require us to think about who paid the price. The truth is less comfortable. Every mile of track was paid for in trees that will never grow again, in labor that permanently damaged the men who performed it, in communities that were built to extract resources and then abandoned when those resources were gone. The railroads did not create American prosperity out of nothing. They converted existing wealth, the ecological wealth of ancient forests and the physical wealth of working bodies, into a different form. A form that benefited some people enormously and other people not at all. This is not an argument against railroads. Transportation infrastructure matters. Economic development matters. The ability to move people and goods across vast distances changed human civilization in ways that are genuinely positive. But we should be honest about costs. We should name the workers who were ground up by the systems we now celebrate. We should acknowledge that the forests we cleared are not coming back, that the debt we incurred against the natural world is still accumulating interest. Somewhere in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there is a stretch of abandoned rail line that has not carried a train in 60 years. The tracks are gone, salvaged during the steel drives of World War II. The stations are gone, burned, or collapsed, or simply bulldozed to make way for something else. But if you walk that right-of-way today, you can still see the ties. They are rotting into the ground and slowly returning to the soil that grew the trees they were made from. Creosote-soaked timbers turning soft with fungal decay. Square-cut oak dissolving back into humus. Some of those ties were placed by men whose names appear in no historical record. Men who earned $26 a month to swing broadexes in frozen forests. Men who rode floating timber down swollen rivers and did not always come back. Men who coughed up black phlegm in creosote plants and did not live to see their grandchildren. They built the network that built the nation, and the nation moved on without looking back. Next time you see a railroad crossing, think about what is beneath those rails. Think about the 3,000 ties per mile. Think about the 30 to 40 million ties per year. Think about the forests that became gravel beds and the workers who became statistics. The iron horses ran on wooden bones, and the men who provided those bones deserve to be remembered. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the kind that looks beneath the surface and names the people who did the work, you should subscribe. We cover the forgotten infrastructure of American industry, the workers who built it, the costs we are still paying. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.